When Marin Holloway arrived in Ashridge Crossing with a deed to 10 acres of worthless rock and a wooden crate full of the ugliest, loudest birds anyone had ever seen, the entire town stopped what they were doing and laughed. Not politely, not quietly. They laughed the way people laugh when they are absolutely certain someone else has already failed. What they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined standing there in the dusty street with their arms crossed and their smiles sharp as broken glass, was that those ridiculous birds were about to save every single one of their lives. And the woman they were laughing at, she was the only one paying close enough attention to understand why. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one goes deep. The wagon creaked under her as it rolled through the main street of Ashridge Crossing, and Marin Holloway kept her eyes forward. Not because she was proud, she had very little left to be proud about, but because she had learned a long time ago that if you looked at the people watching you, you gave them something. You gave them a reaction. You gave them proof that their opinion mattered more than your destination. She was 26 years old. She had $43 and change folded into a cloth pouch tucked inside her boot. She had a deed to land her late uncle had left her. Land she had never seen, that nobody in her family had wanted, that the lawyer in Tucson had described as agriculturally marginal at best. She had a suitcase, a cast iron pan, a bag of seed corn, and a crate of 12 guinea fowl tied to the back of the wagon with rope that had seen better days. The birds were not quiet about any of this. They screamed in that particular way, guinea fowl scream, somewhere between a rusty gate and a child having a very bad day. And the sound carried down the main street of Ashridge Crossing like an announcement nobody had asked for. Dogs lifted their heads. Horses shifted. 3 men standing outside the hardware store turned to look, and when they saw what was making the noise, one of them said something to the others that made all 3 of them laugh. Marin heard it. She always heard it. She just didn't stop. The town itself was what you'd expect from a frontier settlement that had survived on stubbornness and not much else. 2 parallel streets, sun-bleached storefronts, a water trough in the center that was half empty even though it wasn't yet noon. The land around it was flat and brown and reluctant, the kind of landscape that looked like it was tolerating human presence rather than welcoming it. Mountains to the north gave the horizon some shape. The rest was sky and dust and whatever you were willing to make of it. She found the land office without asking for directions. Small town, not many choices. The man behind the counter was named Aldrich Pruitt. She learned this from the nameplate that sat crookedly on the edge of his desk. And he had the specific expression of a person who had spent many years processing paperwork for hopeful people and watching most of those hopes come to nothing. He looked at her deed. He looked at her. He looked at the dust on her coat. "You're the Holloway niece," he said. "Marin Holloway." "Yes." "You've seen the property?" "Not yet." He set the deed down and leaned back in his chair until it creaked in protest. "Miss Holloway, I want to be straight with you, because I'd rather be straight than have you come back here in 6 months angry at me for not saying anything. That parcel your uncle left you, the rocky stretch northeast of town, up toward the base of the Pearson Ridge. It's been sitting empty for 11 years. Your uncle tried to farm it. Man before him tried. Grass won't hold because the soil's too thin, and thin soil means nothing you plant in the ground is going to stay there long. Water drains through before the roots can catch it." Marin picked up the deed and folded it back along its original creases. "Thank you for the warning." "There's more." She waited. "Victor Harlan has been making noises about that land for the past 2 years. He runs cattle up and down the northeast corridor, and your parcel sits right in the middle of his preferred route. He's been asking the council about acquiring it through abandonment law, which requires the property to sit unimproved and untended for a period of— "I know what abandonment law requires," Marin said. "How long do I have?" Pruitt glanced at the paper on his desk. "Technically, the clock resets when a legitimate heir takes possession. So as of today, assuming you file properly, you'd have the standard period before Harlan could make any kind of legal claim, but—" He paused. "He's a patient man, and he has lawyers." "So do I," Marin said, which was not strictly true, but she said it in a way that made Pruitt unsure whether to push the point. She filed the paperwork. She got directions to the property. She drove the wagon out of town with the guinea fowl still screaming behind her, and she didn't look back at the people watching her go. The land was exactly as bad as advertised. Marin sat on the wagon seat for a long time after she arrived, just looking at it. Rocky, yes. Thin-soiled, yes. The previous structure, so her uncle's attempt at a farmhouse, had collapsed in on itself at some point, leaving a heap of gray timber and rusted iron that the weeds had started to reclaim. There was a creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, skinny and determined, feeding off snowmelt from the ridge. That was something. The soil near the creek was darker than the rest, which meant it held water better. Small patches of it, not much. She climbed down from the wagon, walked the length of the property twice, and tried to see it not as what it was, but as what it could be forced to become. That was a skill she'd been practicing since she was 12 years old, and her father had walked out and left her mother with a rental house and 3 children and no income. You learn to look at bad situations and find the argument for continuing, not the silver lining. That was for people who hadn't had enough trouble yet. The argument. The practical, actual reason to keep going. The argument here was thin, but it existed. The soil near the creek could be built up with composting. The rocky sections wouldn't support row crops, but might support raised beds if she could haul enough material. The slope of the land, which everyone seemed to think of as a problem, actually meant natural drainage away from anything she planted at mid-elevation, which would protect roots from rot in the wet season. And the scrub brush that covered the hillside meant insect activity. A lot of it. She looked at the crate of guinea fowl on the back of the wagon. "All right," she said to no one in particular. "Let's see what you can do." She spent the first week doing nothing except survive and observe. The farmhouse ruins were too far gone to salvage as shelter, so she stretched a canvas lean-to between 2 of the more solid standing walls and slept under that while she figured out what the land needed. Every morning she let the guinea fowl out of their crate and watched where they went. She'd raised a small clutch of them back in Missouri when she was 19. A neighbor had kept them, and she'd spent enough time around the property to understand their habits. They weren't like chickens, which were domestic in a way that made them stupid and dependent. Guinea fowl were something else. Half-wild, opinionated. They had territorial instincts and strong preferences, and they moved through a landscape the way experienced hunters moved, methodically, low to the ground, alert. She watched them work the scrub. Within 2 days, she could see patterns. They avoided the thin, rocky soil almost entirely and concentrated on the areas with low brush and leaf cover, exactly the areas where insect density was highest. They scratched at the base of the scrub, caught things too fast to track, argued with each other in their continuous harsh commentary, and then moved on to the next patch. They didn't damage the vegetation. They worked around it, under it, through it. On the 4th day, Marin found a section of the property where the brush was thick and the soil was dark, and the guinea fowl would not go. They approached it, stopped, rattled at each other in a way she hadn't heard before, and turned back. She walked into it herself and crouched down and looked at the ground. It took her a minute to see what they'd sensed. Ticks. Not just a few. The leaf litter was moving with them. She stood up very carefully, backed out, and watched the birds work the perimeter of that section. They didn't go in, but they worked the edge, picking off anything that tried to move outward, containing it. She made a note in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. They know something about this land I don't know yet. Follow their logic. Bamids. The first person who spoke to her at any length without laughing was an old man named Gideon Mercer. He appeared at the edge of her property on a Wednesday morning about 10 days after she arrived, standing at the fence line with his hat in his hands, watching the guinea fowl work the hillside. He was somewhere past 70, bone-thin, with the particular weathered look of someone who had spent most of their life outdoors and had the skin to prove it. He'd been farming the valley for over 40 years. His own land was 2 properties over, and he'd seen every person who'd tried to work the Holloway parcel come and go. Marin saw him standing there and walked over. She'd learned not to wait for people to come to her. They usually didn't. "Gideon Mercer," he said when she reached the fence. "I'm not here to give you trouble." "What are you here for, then?" He nodded toward the birds. "Those aren't common birds." "No, they're guinea fowl. I know what they are." He was quiet for a moment. "My father kept a few back in Tennessee, a long time ago." He watched them move through the scrub. He said they were the best thing he ever had on his land, and nobody believed him either. Something loosened slightly in Marin's chest. Not much, but a little. "You want to come look at what they're doing?" she asked. He did. They walked the property together for the better part of an hour. Marin showed him the tick-heavy section, the perimeter work the birds were doing, the way they concentrated on the areas with the highest brush density. Gideon walked slowly and said very little, but she noticed he was watching the birds with the attention of someone relearning something they'd known a long time ago. "The ticks are bad this year," he said finally. "Worse than I've seen in a while. We lost a calf last month, fever." "How many other farmers are seeing it?" "All of them, some worse than others. The Bellamy spread lost 2 horses. He paused. "It's going to get worse before it gets better." "Always does." Marin looked at the birds working the hillside in the morning light. "How much worse?" Gideon looked at her steadily. "Bad enough to matter, chat." She went into town for supplies on a Friday, and she heard the talk. The mercantile was busy. Frontier towns had a way of using the general store as a kind of informal community center, which meant that buying flour and salt put you in proximity to every conversation happening in a 10-mile radius. The woman behind the counter was named Stella Briggs, quick-handed and sharp-eyed, who had run the store for 20 years and knew the inventory and the gossip with equal precision. "You're the one with the birds," Stella said, when Marin set her list on the counter. "I am." Victor Harlan came in Tuesday. Stella began pulling items without looking at the list. "Asked me if I'd seen you, wanted to know how settled in you looked." Marin kept her expression even. "What did you tell him?" "Told him I hadn't seen you," which was true at the time. Stella glanced up. "He's not going to wait long. He's got a deal with the railroad, or he thinks he does, and your land sits right between his northeastern grazing range and the route he wants to drive cattle for the fall shipment. He needs that corridor. He can't have it. I know that. You know that. Whether the town council sees it that way depends a lot on how useful you are to them. And right now," Stella set a bag of cornmeal on the counter, "you're the woman with the screaming birds on the hill nobody else wanted. That's not useful. That's eccentric." Marin considered that. "Then I need to become useful. That would help?" Stella paused. "The Caldwell boy, Owen Carter, goes by that name. He was taken in by the Caldwells, but they've been struggling since the drought started. He's been watching your property from the road. Seen him 3 mornings in a row. He's 12, maybe 13. Doesn't go to school anymore. Helps wherever someone will take him." "Is he a problem?" "He's an orphan who's curious about your birds and doesn't have anywhere to be. Whether that's a problem depends on what you do with it." Owen Carter showed up at her fence line 2 days later, like Stella had predicted. He was small for whatever age he was, with 2 large ears and a serious expression that looked like it had been worn in by a longer life than he'd actually lived. He stood at the fence with his hands in his pockets, watching the guinea fowl the way kids watch things they're pretending not to be interested in. Marin was mending the corner post of the pen when she noticed him. She kept working for a few minutes before she spoke. "You gonna stand there all morning?" The boy startled slightly, but held his ground. "I'm not on your land." "That's true. You want to come on my land?" A pause. "Those birds are loud." "Yes, they are." "Why do you have them?" Marin set her hammer down and looked at him directly. He was the first person who'd asked that question without an edge of mockery in it. He asked it like he genuinely wanted to know. "They work for me," she said. "Come have a look." He came through the fence gate carefully, like he was conscious of not doing it wrong. She showed him the same things she'd shown Gideon Mercer. The patterns of movement, the tick perimeter, the way the birds worked the brush without destroying it. Owen watched with his arms crossed tight against his chest, which she was coming to understand was his version of rapt attention. "They eat the ticks?" he said. "Everything in the insect category, but the ticks especially." "How do they know where the ticks are?" "Same way a good hunting dog knows where the birds are. They've got instincts that have been selecting for this for a very long time. We just don't usually pay attention because we're too busy trying to make them behave like chickens." Owen frowned at the birds moving through the scrub. One of them turned and stared at him with the blank reptile intensity that guinea fowl specialize in. He stared back. "That one's different," he said. "The markings on her chest are different from the others." Marin looked. He was right. The bird had an unusual white patch below her throat that the others lacked. She hadn't noticed. "You've got a good eye," Marin said. Something happened to Owen's expression that wasn't quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. Can I name her? She'd probably rather not have a name, but go ahead. Duchess, he said immediately, like he'd been thinking about it. The bird made a sound like a saw blade catching. She seems fine with it, Owen said, with complete seriousness. He came back the next day. And the day after that, Marin didn't offer him pay because she didn't have any to offer. She gave him food. She was a practical cook, not a fancy one, but she could make a decent meal out of what she had. And she let him help with the birds, and she answered his questions, which were constant and often better than she expected. He had the kind of mind that wanted to understand systems. Why did this bird do that? What happened when two flocks met? Had she noticed that the birds moved counterclockwise when they were working an unfamiliar patch? She hadn't noticed that last one. She checked, and he was right. Within 2 weeks, he could move through the flock without disturbing them, which was something most adults couldn't manage. Guinea fowl don't like surprises, and they don't respect authority, but they have opinions about individuals. Some people they accept, and some they never do. Owen they accepted. He moved slowly, and he didn't make sudden sounds, and he watched them the way they watched the brush, which maybe they appreciated. He also started naming the others, despite Marin's theoretical objection to the practice. There was Duchess, who was bossy and led the forward scouting. There was General, who was the largest male and spent most of his energy managing territory disputes. There was Biscuit, named for no reason Owen would explain, and Twice, named because it always made the same sound twice in a row, and a dozen others. Marin found herself, against her better judgment, starting to remember the names. It was easier to track behavior when you could distinguish individuals, she told herself. That was the reason. Victor Harlan came to see her on a Thursday in the 4th week. She saw his horse first, a big black quarter horse, expensive, ridden with the casual ease of someone who'd never had to worry whether they could afford to keep it. He came up the dirt path to the property at a walk, unhurried, and pulled up at the fence line without dismounting. Marin was in the east garden bed, which she'd built up with composted material and planted with a test crop of vegetables. The guinea fowl were working the slope above her. She didn't stop what she was doing until she'd finished what she was doing. Then she stood up, brushed the dirt off her knees, and walked over. Victor Harlan was somewhere in his mid-40s, broad through the chest, with the kind of easy confidence that came from having been the most powerful man in a room for long enough that he'd stopped noticing he was doing it. He had a wide hat and a trimmed mustache, and eyes that moved over her property the way eyes move over something they're already in the process of calculating. "Miss Holloway," he said, "I've been meaning to introduce myself. Victor Harlan. My ranch runs along the ridge to the north." "I know who you are," Marin said. Something shifted very slightly behind his eyes. Not offense. He was too controlled for that, but a small recalibration. "Good. Saves the introduction. I came to extend a friendly offer." "Did you?" "I did." He looked out over the property. "This is a hard piece of land to work. I know the history of this parcel. I've watched 3 men try to make something of it. They all had more capital and more equipment than you do, and none of them lasted 2 seasons. He said this without cruelty, in a tone that was almost sympathetic, which she found more irritating than outright dismissal. "I'm prepared to offer you fair market value, which, to be honest, isn't much, given the land's record, plus an additional premium for a fast settlement. You could take that money somewhere else, somewhere with better soil, and make a real start." Marin looked up at him. The sun was behind him, which he'd probably arranged intentionally. "What do you want the land for?" "Grazing corridor. Nothing dramatic." "If it's nothing dramatic, it shouldn't be worth a premium to you." The almost sympathy in his expression cooled by 1 degree. "It's efficient. I'm a man who values efficiency." "So am I," Marin said. "That's why I'm not selling." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the birds moving on the hillside. "Those guinea fowl," he said, they're unusual. A lot of people think so. What are you doing with them?" "Farming," she said. "Same as everyone." He nodded slowly like he was filing something away rather than accepting an answer. "The offer stands if you change your mind, Miss Holloway. I'm a patient man." He turned the horse and rode back down the path without hurrying. Marin stood at the fence and watched him go, and she felt the specific cold feeling you get when you understand that a situation has just begun rather than been resolved. The weeks that followed were the hardest kind of hard. The steady, grinding, unspectacular kind that doesn't make for good stories because there's no single moment to point to. Marin built up the garden beds. She hauled creek sediment in a bucket, trip after trip, to improve the thin uphill soil. She repaired the corner of the ruined farmhouse that was still structurally sound enough to serve as a storage space, working in the evenings after the light got low. She tracked the birds' patterns in her notebook every day, adjusting where she planted based on where they were concentrating their work. The vegetable beds started producing. Not dramatically, not in a way that would make anyone look twice from the road. But the test crop of root vegetables she'd planted in the composted beds came in strong, and the leafy greens she'd tried in the partial shade section near the ruined wall were doing better than they had any logical right to. The key, she was starting to understand, was that the guinea fowl weren't just controlling insects, they were changing the soil chemistry. Their droppings were nitrogen heavy. Every farmer knew that birds were good for soil fertility. But the way they worked the surface, scratching and turning the top layer without digging deeply enough to disturb plant roots, was creating a constant low-level tillage that she couldn't have achieved with a hand tool without damaging what was growing. She wrote this down carefully in the back of her notebook where she kept observations she wasn't ready to talk about yet. The birds are doing something with this land that I don't have a name for yet. Something about the interaction between their movement and the soil composition and the insect balance. Need to watch longer. Gideon came by once a week now. They'd fallen into an easy pattern. He'd show up in the morning, they'd walk the property. He'd say very little and observe very carefully, and occasionally he'd make a remark that sent Marin's thinking in a new direction. He'd been farming this valley for 40 years, and he carried the accumulated knowledge of that time the way old farmers often do, not in organized theories, but in a bank of specific memories. "Your crops look different," he said one morning, standing at the edge of the garden beds. "Different how?" "Healthier than they should, given the soil, given the water situation." He crouched down and looked at the leaves of the nearest plant. "No insect damage." "That's the birds." "I know it's the birds. That's not what I mean." He stood up slowly, his knees protesting. "The color, the density of the leaves. Something's happening to the nutrition of the soil." He looked at her. "Has it occurred to you that the birds are the reason anything grows here at all? And that the land you've been farming isn't really marginal? It's been waiting?" Marin looked at the garden. "Waiting for what?" "The right kind of intervention." He picked up a handful of soil and let it run through his fingers. "Your uncle planted the same way everyone plants, cleared the scrub, tilled deep, planted row crops, watched everything die. He was fighting the land. You're not fighting it. You're working with what it already had." She sat with that for a long time after he left. The drought news came in late summer, and it was bad. The valley had been in a dry pattern for 2 years, and the rainfall that season came in at less than half what the area needed. Marin heard about it in pieces. At the mercantile, from Gideon, from Owen, who picked up everything people said around him because people forgot he was listening. The Bellamy spread lost most of their grain crop. The Riordan family, who ran the largest vegetable operation in the valley, replanted twice and lost the second planting the same way they'd lost the first. The thin soil couldn't hold moisture long enough to see the roots through. A family named Caswell, who'd been in the valley 15 years and had a reputation for solid farming, put their property up for sale in August. Marin's garden kept producing. Not abundantly. She wasn't feeding a town, but steadily. The root crops especially. The composted beds held moisture in a way the surrounding dry soil didn't, and the guinea fowl's constant activity kept insect pressure off the plants, even as drought stress made everything more vulnerable. She harvested enough to eat well and preserve some for winter, which put her in a position that was increasingly unusual in the valley. She didn't talk about it in town. She bought her supplies, listened to what people were saying, and went back to her property and worked. But she noticed that people had started watching her differently, less with the straight mockery of the early weeks, more with the uncomfortable attention people give to a situation they don't want to acknowledge. Owen noticed it too. "They're not laughing at you the same way," he said one afternoon. He was sitting on the fence rail watching her work the composted beds, Duchess perched nearby in her self-appointed supervisory capacity. "No," Marin agreed. "That's because they're scared." He pulled at a thread on his sleeve. When the Caswells left, I heard Mr. Briggs at the Mercantile, Stella's husband, say that if the drought kept on, 3 more families would be gone by spring. Marin sat back on her heels. Did he say which 3? No, but everyone knows the ones who are thin already, the ones who borrowed too much during the good years. Owen looked at the birds working the hillside. Are we going to be okay? Our land, I mean. Marin noticed the hour and didn't point it out. We're going to keep doing what we're doing, she said. The birds are telling us something about this land that nobody else is listening to. We're going to keep listening. Owen nodded like that settled something. I think the flock is too small, he said. What? For what the land needs. We've got 12 birds working maybe 4 of the 10 acres really well, and the other 6 acres are getting partial coverage at best. If we doubled the flock, we'd double the, he paused, reaching for the word. The footprint. The coverage. Marin stared at him. That's right, she said slowly. I know. He hopped off the fence rail. I've been thinking about it. Also, Duchess is going to lay eggs soon. I've been watching the nest behavior. If we don't increase the flock artificially, she's going to do it naturally, but that takes longer. How do you know she's going to lay soon? Owen pointed. The way she's been moving through the scrub is different this week. Slower, more deliberate. And she stopped fighting with General for patch priority, which she only does when she doesn't want the attention. He looked at Marin. I could be wrong. You could be, Marin said, but you probably aren't. Duchess made a noise that could have meant anything. See? Owen said. Berwon. The question of money was a constant, low-grade pressure she'd learned to work around rather than solve. She had almost nothing left. The $43 had become $12, and the $12 had become expenses. Nails, seed, the cornmeal and salt that kept her eating. She had no livestock to sell, no crop surplus large enough to market, no real standing in the community that would make a bank in Ashridge Crossing likely to extend credit to a woman farming a property. Everyone still considered a lost cause. Victor Harlan had sent a second letter through the land office, not to her directly, but filed as a formal expression of interest. A legal move that Pruitt had informed her about with the cautious neutrality of a man who'd been told to stay out of it. The letter cited the railroad corridor again and offered a number that was higher than the first offer, which told her the first offer had been low. She didn't respond. Instead, she started doing something she'd been considering for weeks. She went to see the families who were struggling, not to offer help. She was in no position to offer help, but to look, to understand the specific nature of what was going wrong on neighboring properties. She knocked on doors and asked questions and listened, and what she learned was that almost every struggling farm in the valley had 2 things in common: catastrophic insect damage to whatever crops survived the drought, and tick problems severe enough to be affecting their livestock. 2 things that, on her land, were non-existent because of the birds. She went home and sat in her lean-to in the dark and turned the problem over and over until she started to see the shape of something. The birds weren't just keeping her land healthy. They were the difference between failure and survival in this specific ecosystem, in this specific drought year, on this specific type of land. She was sitting on the only working solution to the valley's agricultural crisis, and she was sitting on it alone, with 12 birds and a boy who named them. She opened her notebook and wrote 2 words at the top of a new page. Scale this. She stared at them for a long time. She crossed them out. She wrote, not yet. Watch longer. There's something you don't understand yet about what's coming. She had no idea how right she was. Bob, the last thing that happened that fall, before everything changed, was that she planted the hillside, not row crops. She knew better than that now. But she'd noticed that the birds were most effective in terrain with moderate ground cover, low brush, leaf litter, grass patches. Bare soil gave them nothing to work with and provided no habitat for the insects they were managing. Dense, heavy brush was too thick for them to penetrate effectively. The sweet spot was the middle ground, and she'd been watching it on her own property long enough to start replicating it. She seeded the rocky upper hillside with a mixture of native grasses and low-growing scrub plants, things she'd collected seed from along the creek and around the property edges all summer. It would take time for them to establish, maybe a full season, maybe 2. But if they took hold, she'd be able to run a larger flock across a larger area, which meant more coverage, which meant more of what was already saving her farm. Owen helped her plant, kneeling in the thin soil in the cold October light, pressing seeds into the ground with a patience she found remarkable in a 12-year-old. "What if they don't come up?" he asked. "Some of them won't. Enough of them will." "How do you know?" "I don't. But the alternative to planting is not planting, and not planting has a guaranteed outcome." She pressed a seed into the soil and covered it. "This at least has a chance." Owen considered that. "Duchess had eggs," he said. "6 of them. I found the nest this morning." Maren stopped what she was doing. "You didn't touch them?" "No, I just looked. She's staying close to that section near the old wall, the warm part, with the good afternoon sun. I think she chose it on purpose." Maren looked toward the ruined wall at the bottom of the slope. Even from this distance, she could see the slight flicker of movement that was Duchess moving through the grass near it. 6 eggs. Not 12 birds anymore. 18 eventually, if the odds held. More if the other females followed. The flock was growing before she'd managed to figure out what to do with what she already had. She looked up at the sky, which was the hard blue of a late autumn afternoon, cold and flat and completely indifferent. "Scale this," she thought again, "but carefully. There's something else coming, and you need to be ready." She pressed another seed into the ground. The wind moved across the hillside. Somewhere below, the guinea fowl moved through the scrub in their restless, tireless way, eating what the valley didn't know it needed eaten, cleaning what it didn't know was already infected, getting ready, in their own unreasonable way, for what came next. Duchess's 6 eggs became 5 keats, then 4 surviving ones. Then, against the odds that govern most things on that hillside, all 4 grew past the fragile early weeks and joined the flock. It happened slowly, the way most things on Maren's property happened, without fanfare and without witnesses. One morning there were 12 birds. A month later, there were 16. Owen tracked the count the way other boys might track baseball scores, updating Maren each morning as if she hadn't already done her own head count at dawn. 17 now, he told her on a Tuesday in November, climbing through the fence gate with his coat buttoned wrong and his boots still unlaced, which was how he always arrived when he had news he was excited about. General chased off that red-tail hawk that's been circling, and Duchess kept the keats in the brush the whole time. Didn't lose any. "I saw," Maren said. She was at the fire, heating water. "Sit down and fix your boots before you trip over them." He sat on the upturned bucket she kept near the lean-to and worked at the laces without looking at them, still talking. "The 4 from Duchess's clutch are almost full size now. You can tell them apart from the original 12 because they move a little different, tighter together, like they learned to stay close during the hawk scares. Behavior shapes faster than people think," Maren said, "especially when the pressure is real." Owen nodded like she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. He had that quality, the ability to receive information and fold it immediately into what he already believed, without the resistance that adults usually brought to new ideas. She'd noticed it early and thought about it often. It was either the sign of a very open mind or a very undeveloped one, and the more time she spent with him, the more certain she was it was the former. The cold had come down from the ridge by November, not brutal yet, but insistent, the kind that reminded you every morning that the easy season was finished. Maren had winterized the lean-to as well as she could. Canvas sides, a small iron stove she'd bought secondhand from the mercantile, a stack of firewood that Owen had helped her split and stack against the south wall of the ruined farmhouse. It wasn't comfortable, exactly, but she'd been less comfortable than this and survived it. The vegetable beds were mostly done for the season. She'd harvested everything harvestable and put it up, root vegetables in the cold cellar she'd dug against the north-facing slope, dried beans in the storage corner of the ruined farmhouse, preserved goods in the row of jars she kept on the wooden shelf Owen had built for her, badly but sturdily, in his first real attempt at carpentry. The shelf leaned slightly to the left. She'd shimmed it with a folded piece of leather, and it had held. What the winter gave her, mostly, was time to think. She spent the cold months the way she'd spent the summer months, observing the birds, making notes, reading back through everything she'd written since she arrived. The notebook was half full now, dense with small observations that individually meant very little and collectively meant something she was still in the process of understanding. The pattern that kept emerging was this. Wherever the guinea fowl spent sustained time, The insect population shifted. Not just dropped, shifted. The aggressive biting insects, the parasitic ones, the ones that damaged crops and livestock, those decreased dramatically. But certain other insect populations, the ones that lived in the soil and helped break down organic matter, seemed to be unaffected or even increased. The birds were hunting selectively, whether they knew it or not, and the result was something more complex than simple pest control. She wrote this down and underlined it twice. It was Gideon who helped her name what she was seeing. He came by on a cold December morning, unexpected, which was unusual for him. He was a man of established habits. He had his hat pulled low and his coat collar up, and he looked tired in a way she hadn't seen before. She brought him inside the lean-to and gave him hot coffee, which she couldn't really afford but made anyway, because he was old and the wind was mean, and some things mattered more than accounting. "The Riordan family is leaving," he said, both hands around the cup. Maren set her own cup down. "When?" "Spring. They've been trying to sell the property since October. Victor Harlan made an offer last week." He looked at the stove. "It's a low offer, but they'll take it. They don't have a choice." "How many is that now? Families leaving?" "The Caswells in August, the Hendersons in October, now the Riordans." He counted something in his head. 6 families have sold or abandoned in the past 18 months. All of it going to Harlan or to the Harlan-backed land trust he operates through, the one called Ridgeline Holdings. He's been buying up parcels for 2 years. Maren was quiet for a moment. "And the railroad deal he mentioned? Still in the air. But if the rail line comes through where the survey suggests, the land values in the Northeast Corridor will triple. Maybe more." Gideon looked at her. "That's what your 10 acres are worth to him. Not what they're worth now. What they'll be worth in 3 years." She hadn't known about the projected land value increase. She filed it away carefully. "The drought's doing his work for him," she said. "Partly. But the ticks are the thing that's finishing it." Gideon set down his cup. "I lost 2 goats last month. Fever. The Wentworth spread has had horses sick since October. The tick problem this year is worse than anything I've seen in 40 years on this land." He paused. "And yet here on your 10 acres, nothing. No sick animals. Your birds look healthy. Your soil looked good coming into winter. How?" Maren didn't answer right away. She looked at the notebook on the small table beside her cot, and then she looked at Gideon, who had earned her trust in the specific way that patient people earn it, by showing up and saying useful things and never once asking her to be grateful. "The birds eat ticks," she said. "You know that part, but it's not just the ones they can see. The tick population has a life cycle. Eggs in the leaf litter, larvae in the soil layer, nymphs on low vegetation before they find a host. The birds work all 3 levels. They don't just remove the adult ticks, they're disrupting the cycle at every stage." She picked up the notebook and turned to a page she'd marked. "My count over the past 2 months. I've been doing systematic sweeps of different sections of the property, same method each time, counting tick presence on a square yard fabric drag. The sections where the birds concentrate their work are showing near 0 counts at every life stage. It's not pest control. It's eradication." Gideon looked at the notebook for a long time. "How long would it take," he said carefully, "to clean a property that was already infected? If the birds were introduced? I don't know. Depends on the severity, the acreage, the terrain. Here, on my land, I think the birds established tick control gradually over the first few months, and it's been holding since late summer." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I've been thinking," he said, "about what happens when the tick problem gets bad enough that people start dying. Not just livestock, people." He said this without drama, as a plain statement of what he'd been calculating. "Rocky Mountain spotted fever. It's tick-borne. We had a case of it 5 years ago. A ranch hand on the Bellamy spread. He survived, but barely. If the tick population in this valley is at the level you're describing, and if we have a warm, wet spring that promotes breeding—" He stopped. "I'm not trying to frighten you." "You're not frightening me," Maren said. "You're informing me. There's a difference." He almost smiled at that. "The flock," he said. 17 birds now? 17. And Duchess is showing pre-laying behavior again. You're going to need more than 17 birds if what I'm describing comes to pass." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about the same thing." What she didn't say because she hadn't worked out how to say it yet, was that she'd also been thinking about what it would mean to offer the birds services to the surrounding valley and what that would cost her and what it might cost her not to. She hadn't worked that out yet, so she kept it to herself and let the winter continue. The cold months passed the way they always did, slowly in the middle, quickly at the edges, leaving behind a residue of things endured. Marin repaired the farmhouse corner further, enough that she could stand up fully inside it, and moved her storage operation in there when the lean-to canvas started giving out along the south seam. She ordered a second crate of guinea fowl from a breeder in the next county, 12 more birds, which cost her $8 she didn't have, and charged to a small account at the mercantile that Stella Briggs extended without being asked, in the way that practical women sometimes extend help to each other without making a production of it. "You can pay it back when you have it," Stella said, writing the amount in her ledger without looking up. "I've got no particular interest in watching you fail." "That's generous," Marin said. "It's practical. This town has lost 6 families in a year and a half, and we're going to lose more. I'd rather have a farm that works on that hill than another empty parcel going to Harlan's land trust." Stella capped her pen. "Also, you're one of the few people who pays her account reliably and without argument, which is rarer than you'd think." The new birds arrived in February, thin and rattled from the journey, and Marin spent 3 weeks integrating them into the existing flock, a process that required patience because guinea fowl have strong opinions about hierarchy, and the original 16 were not interested in pretending otherwise. There were 3 days of sustained territorial argument that produced more noise than the property had generated since she'd arrived. Owen managed it with a competence that was starting to become ordinary to her, which she thought about sometimes. How quickly you could start to take someone's capability for granted. "General's establishing precedent with the new males," Owen explained, watching the proceedings from the fence rail. "It's not actually fighting. Nobody's getting hurt. It's more like a very loud negotiation." "It sounds like the county courthouse," Marin said. Owen looked at her. "Have you been to the county courthouse?" Once or twice, he absorbed this. "For the land?" "For the land, yes." She'd made 2 trips to the county seat that winter, long, cold rides in the wagon, to review the legal status of her property and to understand what Harlan's lawyers were doing with the abandonment law question. What she learned was that the law was clear and she was on solid ground, but that solid ground in law and solid ground in practice were not always the same thing, especially in a county where Victor Harlan had been donating to the council members' political campaigns for 15 years. The lawyer she'd spoken to, a young woman named Cora Aldis, who worked out of a cramped office above the assay shop and had the specific energy of someone who'd had to fight for every credential she had been direct with her. "You're legally protected as long as you can demonstrate active improvement of the property," Cora had said, spreading the relevant documents across her desk. "Harlan can file claims, and his lawyers can make noise, but a genuine working farm with documented productivity is not an abandonable property under any reading of the statute." "He'll keep filing anyway," Marin said. "Almost certainly. The goal isn't to win. The goal is to make continuing expensive enough for you that you give up and sell." Cora looked at her over the top of her reading glasses. "So the practical answer is, don't give up, and document everything, every improvement, every crop, every date and measurement. Paper is what stands between you and a legal argument that you weren't really farming." Marin had been documenting everything since she arrived. The notebook was nearly full now. She bought a second one from the mercantile. By the time spring arrived, real spring, not the false warm spells that February threw out as a test, the flock numbered 29 birds. Duchess had laid again, a second clutch, and the Keats from the first clutch were now fully integrated adults who had taken on the territorial habits of their parent flock. The new birds from February had settled into the existing hierarchy without the chaos of the first weeks. The whole flock moved across the property with an efficiency that Marin found easier to observe now that she knew what to look for. The way they divided the terrain into working sections without coordination she could see. The way they rotated through areas they'd already worked to catch anything that had hatched in the interval. She was doing her spring tick survey, the same fabric drag method she'd been using all winter, when she found the anomaly. The southwest corner of her property shared a fence line with the Bellamy spread. She'd had minimal contact with the Bellamys. They were cattle people, not particularly friendly, dealing with enough of their own troubles that neighborly visits weren't a priority. But the southwest corner of her land had always shown slightly higher tick counts than the rest of her property, and she'd attributed it to the prevailing wind direction and the density of the brush along that fence line. This morning, dragging the white fabric square along the fence, she pulled it up and counted. Her hand went still. 43 ticks on a single drag. On any other section of her property, that number would run between 0 and 2. She stood up and looked at the fence line. On the Bellamy side, the ground cover was thick and undisturbed. Nobody had run cattle through there recently, which meant the vegetation had grown dense, which meant exactly the kind of tick habitat that the rest of her land had been systematically dismantled. Whatever was happening on the Bellamy spread was bleeding across the fence line faster than her birds could manage the perimeter. She went back to the farmhouse and stood in the storage corner for a long time, looking at nothing in particular. Then she took out the second notebook and started a new section. She titled it Boundary Problem and wrote underneath, "The flock can protect what it controls. It cannot protect against what arrives continuously from outside the perimeter. This is not a problem I can solve alone." She looked at that last sentence for a while. Owen found her there when he arrived that afternoon, coat still on, reading over her shoulder with the complete absence of self-consciousness that she'd stopped finding surprising. "What's the boundary problem?" he asked. She showed him the drag count from the southwest corner. He looked at it. His mouth did something complicated. "The Bellamys," he said, "and probably everywhere else along the fence lines." She leaned back. "The birds are working, Owen. They're really working. But the property is like an island right now, and tick populations don't respect fence lines. So we need the neighbors to run birds too. We'd need to get birds to the neighbors first, and the neighbors would need to be willing. And the neighbors right now are dealing with enough that asking them to take on new livestock, even temporary, even borrowed." She stopped. Owen was already ahead of her, she could tell. He had that look. "What if we didn't ask them to take them permanently?" he said. "What if we moved the flock, rotated them, brought the birds to a problem property, let them work it, moved them on? We've got 29 birds. A property the size of the Bellamy spread would need more than 29, yeah." He sat down on the upturned bucket. "Duchess is going to lay again. And the February birds, 2 of the females are showing the same pre-lay behavior Duchess showed last fall. I've been watching them. We could be at 40 birds by midsummer if the hatching goes well." Marin looked at him. He was 13 years old. He was sitting in a ruined farmhouse corner with his coat still on, doing arithmetic about guinea fowl reproduction as a solution to a regional agricultural crisis, and he was not wrong about any of it. "You've been thinking about this for a while," she said. "Since you showed me the first drag counts in February," he admitted. "I didn't say anything because I didn't know how to say it yet. She almost said you should have told me sooner and then stopped herself because that wasn't fair." She'd been thinking about the same thing for just as long and hadn't said anything to him either. You didn't say things until you'd worked them out enough to say them right. That was a rule she'd established for herself long ago, and it appeared Owen had arrived at it independently. 40 birds might be enough to make a meaningful difference on one neighboring property, she said. Not the whole valley. No, he agreed. Not yet. That yet sat between them like a statement of intent. She would think about it later. In the particular way she turned problems over at night, lying in the farmhouse corner on her cot with the iron stove ticking down and the sound of the birds settling in the scrub outside. The flock had grown faster than she'd expected. The land had responded better than she'd expected. The problems were also worse than she'd expected. The tick boundary issue, the scale of the valley's distress, the legal pressure from Harlan that Cora Aldis was managing but couldn't eliminate. The variables were multiplying, the window for action was narrowing, and there was something else, something she'd noticed in the past 2 weeks that she hadn't written down yet, because writing it down made it more real. Victor Harlan's men had been riding the ridge road above her property. Not often, once or twice a week, and always casually, the way men ride when they want to look like they're not looking at something. But they were looking. She'd caught the glint of field glasses once, up on the eastern slope, and the pattern of the rides was too regular to be coincidental. He knew the flock was growing. He knew something was working on that hillside that hadn't worked for 11 years. And Victor Harlan was not a man who watched something work and stayed patient indefinitely. She wrote that down, finally, at the bottom of the boundary problem page. He's going to move before you're ready, The question is whether you can make yourself more useful to this town than he is before he does. She closed the notebook. Outside, the guinea fowl moved through the spring evening in their relentless way, picking the land clean of what shouldn't be there, keeping the balance she'd been fighting to establish since the day she'd arrived with $43 and a crate of ugly birds that nobody wanted. The valley spread out beyond the fence line, wide and dry and full of trouble she couldn't see yet. She was going to have to see it before it arrived. The warm spring Gideon had feared arrived in late April, soft and wet and deceptive in the way that genuinely dangerous things often are. The rains came in short, heavy bursts that soaked the ground without running off, and the temperature climbed fast enough that the vegetation responded before anything else could catch up. By the first week of May, the valley floor was greener than it had been in 2 drought years, and people walking into town were saying maybe the worst was over, maybe the land was turning, maybe they'd been catastrophizing. Myron heard this talk and felt uneasy in a way she couldn't fully articulate. She was doing her weekly drag count on the southwest fence line when Gideon came through the gate without knocking. He'd stopped knocking months ago, which she'd decided to interpret as familiarity rather than rudeness. And she could tell from the way he walked that whatever he was carrying was heavy. "Wentworth lost a man," he said. She stood up from her crouch. "Lost him how?" "Fever. Started 4 days ago. High, real high. The kind that doesn't break on its own." Gideon stopped a few feet away and took off his hat, which he only did when he was saying something he wanted her to take seriously. "Doc Pruitt says it's spotted fever, tick-borne." Marin was quiet. A meadowlark called somewhere on the slope above them, indifferent to all of it. "How old?" she said. 22, ranch hand, been with the Wentworths 3 seasons. Gideon put his hat back on. He had a wife. She's pregnant. There was nothing useful to say to that, so she didn't say anything. She looked at the drag cloth in her hand. 41 ticks on the morning's southwest count, up from last week's 43, which meant the boundary pressure was at least not increasing, but that was cold comfort given what Gideon had just told her. "It's starting," she said. "It's started," he corrected her. She pulled the count data from the past 6 weeks out of her coat pocket. She kept the recent pages folded there now, instead of in the notebook because she wanted them reachable, and looked at the numbers that had been worrying her since February. The tick population in the valley wasn't just elevated. It was at a level she'd never seen documented in any of the agricultural literature she'd managed to borrow from the county seat library, a collection that was small and outdated, but better than nothing. "The warm, wet spring activated every egg that survived the winter," she said, thinking out loud rather than explaining. The population was already at high levels from last year. This is what exponential growth looks like when you remove the limiting factor. In this case, there are no natural predators working the valley except on my land. "Can the birds work faster than the population is growing?" "On my land, yes. They're holding. But," she looked at the southwest fence line, "the Bellamy spread is feeding this perimeter every day. Whatever's on their land is a source. My birds can manage what's here, but they can't offset a constant inflow." Gideon looked at her steadily. "How long before you can move a flock to neighboring properties?" "Duchess's second clutch is at 3 weeks. Another 5-6 weeks before those Keats are mobile." She did the arithmetic she'd been doing in her head for a month. "We're at 31 birds right now. I was going to wait until 40 to think about moving any of them, because I need enough coverage here to maintain what we have." "You may not have 6 weeks." "I know that," she said. "I know." The next 10 days moved fast and badly. The word about the Wentworth ranch hand spread through Ashridge Crossing. The way bad news spreads in small towns. Faster than light, slower than it should be, distorted at the edges but accurate at the core. By the time most people heard it, it had already been followed by more news. A child on the Bellamy spread was running a fever, pulled from the fields and put to bed. Doc Pruitt riding out the next morning in a way that meant it was serious. Then a woman in town, wife of the blacksmith, whose yard backed onto the open scrub east of Main Street, developed symptoms on a Wednesday and was bedridden by Thursday. Marin heard all of this from Owen, who had become a reliable circuit of information without trying to be, moving between the town and the farm and the surrounding properties with the invisibility of a child that adults had stopped noticing. "People are talking about medicine," he told her, "but Doc Pruitt says there isn't any treatment that works reliably. You just try to manage the fever and hope." That's accurate, Marin said. Spotted fever is bacterial. You need to prevent it, not treat it. How do you prevent it? You eliminate the vector. She looked at him. The ticks. You remove the ticks, and the disease transmission stops. Owen sat with that for a moment. Then you have the only answer in this valley. Maybe. Not maybe. Yes. He said it without drama, plainly, the way he said things he was certain of. You've been sitting on the answer, and the disease is here now. She didn't argue with him. He wasn't wrong. But the situation was not as simple as he was framing it, and she was going to have to explain why, which she disliked doing because explaining the complexity of something usually felt like finding reasons not to act. If I send birds to neighboring properties and something goes wrong, if a bird dies, if the flock gets disrupted, if the tick control on my own land slips while I'm splitting the operation, I could end up with nothing working anywhere. And then Victor Harlan has exactly the evidence he needs that this farm isn't viable. Owen looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as the one he wore when he thought she was wrong but was choosing his words carefully. The Wentworth man is dead, he said. The blacksmith's wife is sick. The Bellamy kid. He stopped. I walked past the Bellamy place yesterday. I could see the child's window from the road. The curtains were drawn. Marin was quiet for a long moment. How are the February females looking? She said. Nest behavior started 4 days ago on both of them. I've been watching. And the current flock coverage? If I pulled 10 birds to run on the Bellamy perimeter, what does that do to the southwest boundary work? Owen thought about it. Not quickly. Carefully. It weakens the southwest approach, but the interior of the property would hold. The original flock knows the terrain well enough now that 12 birds covering interior ground is better than 29 birds spread across everything. He paused. And if the Bellamy land starts being managed, the inflow to our southwest perimeter stops. It's a net gain even if it looks like a loss up front. She thought about how old he was. 13. He was working out ecological systems logic at 13 years old because he'd been watching birds and soil and perimeter counts for 8 months and he'd paid attention to all of it. You're right, she said. Get me the count on the east sector from this morning. He had it memorized. She went to see Walt Bellamy that afternoon. Walt Bellamy was a heavy-set, sun-darkened man of about 50 who had farmed his spread for 20 years and had the reputation of someone who solved problems with work and more work and didn't believe in complications. His daughter, the child in the sickbed, was 7 years old. He met Marin at his gate with the specific expression of a man who was frightened and dealing with it by being bristly. Miss Holloway. Not unfriendly, not friendly either. Mr. Bellamy, I heard about your daughter. His jaw tightened. She's holding. Doc says the fever's not as high as the Wentworth boys was. I'm glad. She met his eyes. I want to talk to you about your land, specifically about the tick situation. Something shifted in his expression. Defensive, then calculating, then tired. What about it? You've got severe infestation. I can see it from my fence line. The ground cover density, the way your cattle are moving, the areas they're avoiding, and what's on your land is feeding into mine across the boundary, which I've been managing with my guinea fowl, but I can't offset an unlimited external source. You're here to complain about my land. No, I'm here to offer you 10 birds. He stared at her. Guinea fowl, she said. My flock. They eat ticks at every life stage. Egg, larva, nymph, adult. I've been documenting the results on my property for 8 months. I'll loan you 10 birds, show you how to manage them, and the perimeter between our properties gets cleaned from both sides. It's not a guaranteed cure for what your daughter has. That's Doc Pruitt's work. But it stops more exposure. Bellamy was quiet for a long time. The wind came off the ridge and moved through the dry grass of his yard. Somewhere in the house, something moved. Those birds are loud, he said finally. Yes, they are. My cattle are already half spooked from everything that's been going on. They'll adjust in 3 or 4 days. The cattle and the birds establish a tolerance. I've watched it on my own land with the horses I've had through. Another silence. She could see him running the math. The pride cost of accepting help from the woman everyone had laughed at versus the practical cost of his daughter lying in a darkened room with a tick-borne fever. How do I manage them? He said. I don't know anything about guinea fowl. I'll come every morning for the first week. My boy, Owen Carter, he knows the birds as well as I do. He can manage the daily work. Bellamy's eyes moved. The Carter orphan? Caldwell's been looking for work for that boy. He works for me, Marin said. He's been working for me since fall. He knows what he's doing. Another silence, shorter this time. All right, Bellamy said. Try it. She sent 10 birds to the Bellamy spread the next morning. Owen went with them and spent the day establishing the flock pattern on the new terrain, which he managed with a patience that impressed even Marin, who was used to his patience. Guinea fowl in unfamiliar territory are difficult and vocal and stubborn about their preferences, and introducing them to new ground took a steady hand and a complete absence of urgency. Owen had both. By evening, he reported that the birds had begun working the southwestern boundary of the Bellamy property, exactly where the density was worst. Marin, alone on her own spread with 21 birds instead of 31, walked her perimeter twice that evening and told herself the coverage was holding. It was holding, barely. The fever cases in Ashridge Crossing jumped from 3 to 7 in the week that followed. Doc Pruitt, a sparse and precise man who had been practicing medicine in the valley for 16 years, requested an emergency session of the town council. Marin heard about this from Stella Briggs, who heard about it from the councilman whose wife bought dry goods at the Mercantile every Tuesday. Pruitt told them it's a public health situation, Stella said, filling Marin's order without being asked, because she had the list memorized by now. He used those exact words, public health situation. He said if the tick population isn't managed, the outbreak will spread from livestock to people systemically, and a frontier town without a real hospital doesn't have the infrastructure to manage a systemic outbreak. What did the council say? They asked about medicine. Pruitt said medicine doesn't exist in the form they're imagining. Then they asked about quarantine. He said quarantine doesn't work on a tick-borne pathogen. You'd have to quarantine the entire valley. Stella set the last item on the counter. Then someone asked if there was any other approach. And? Stella looked at her. Pruitt mentioned your land. He said he'd heard from Gideon Mercer that your property has shown no tick presence and no fever cases, and that the guinea fowl operation you're running might be the closest thing to a working solution available. Marin was quiet. Victor Harlan was at the meeting, Stella added. He left before it finished. That piece of information sat in Marin's chest with a particular weight. That same evening, she found a dead bird on the southeast corner of her property. Not a guinea fowl, a wild bird, a dove, found in the grass near the fence line. She crouched over it and looked at it carefully without touching it, and what she saw made her stay crouched for a long time, staring. The bird's skin, where the feathers had parted, was heavily parasitized. Not just ticks. The concentration was extreme, the kind she associated with the worst of the Bellamy southwest boundary counts. She looked up at the fence line. On the far side, beyond the eastern property boundary, was a stretch of public land, scrub and dry creek bed that nobody managed and nobody owned, that ran in a rough corridor between her land and the town proper. She'd done drag counts along this line before, but not recently. Not since she'd focused the monitoring effort on the Bellamy Southwest problem. She got up and got her drag cloth. The count from the public land fence line was 67. She stood in the failing evening light and looked at that number and understood several things at once. The Bellamy Southwest boundary was not the only source. The public land corridor was unmanaged, dense with ground cover, completely untouched by any kind of tick predation, and it ran like a highway connecting her eastern perimeter to the center of Ashridge Crossing. Every person who walked that corridor, every animal, every wind-blown piece of debris was moving tick population directly from the worst unmanaged habitat in the valley into the town itself. This was not a problem with 3 neighbors and 31 birds. This was a valley-wide problem. She went back to the farmhouse and sat on her cot and did not sleep for a long time. She thought about what Owen had said. You have the only answer in this valley, and turned it over and looked at its underside, which was this. Having the only answer to a large problem is not the same as being able to implement it. The flock could double. It could triple. But doubling or tripling took time, and time was the thing the valley didn't have anymore. In the morning, she rode into town and went to find Doc Pruitt. His office was a single room above the land office, reached by an outside stair that was missing its second step, which she'd learned to skip over on her 2 previous visits. He was at his desk when she came in, writing something in a ledger, and he looked up without surprise, which meant he'd been expecting her. Gideon told me you might come. he said. How many cases? 7 confirmed. 3 more I consider probable, but haven't diagnosed formally because the families are managing at home and don't want the social cost of a confirmed fever case. He set down his pen. The Bellamy child is improving. That's genuine good news. But the Wentworth case was fatal, and the blacksmith's wife is not responding as well as I'd like. I found count numbers on the Eastern Public Land Corridor last night that explain a significant part of the transmission pathway, Marin said. That stretch of scrub is acting as a reservoir and a transport route simultaneously. Prewitt absorbed this. What do you need? I need to understand the outbreak timeline. How long before more cases? How fast is the transmission rate? What's your actual medical capacity if this doubles? He told her, straight and without softening. It was worse than she'd been calculating. And what I need from you, she said, is to go back to the town council and tell them you have a potential intervention, not a guaranteed solution, a potential intervention that requires their cooperation. Your birds, he said. My birds, yes, but not just my birds on my land. My birds, loaned out systematically to the surrounding properties with management support. She laid out the rough shape of what she'd been thinking through the sleepless night. Not the full plan. The full plan wasn't ready, but enough for him to take to the council. Rotating flocks, property by property tick management, starting with the highest density sources and working outward. Prewitt listened without interrupting, which she'd noticed was his characteristic mode. He was the kind of doctor who'd learned that most of the information you needed was in what people told you if you stayed quiet long enough to hear it. There's a complication, he said when she finished. Victor Harlan. He spoke to 2 council members yesterday. I don't know what he said, but the tone of the afternoon session was different from the morning session. He looked at her steadily. He's positioning himself as the person who will organize the community response. He's been in contact with a supplier in the next county about purchasing what he calls pest management livestock, which I believe means guinea fowl, Marin said flatly. I believe so. He's proposing that the community consolidate its response under his management, with him controlling the livestock and the deployment strategy. She sat back. The specific cold feeling from the day he'd ridden up to her fence line and talked about efficiency was back, sharper this time. He doesn't know anything about managing guinea fowl, she said. I imagine he would hire people who do, possibly from outside the county. Prewitt met her eyes. The issue isn't his knowledge. The issue is that if he controls the community response, he controls the relationship the community has with its own survival. And that's a kind of leverage that tends to last a long time. Marin thought about what Gideon had told her months ago. He's a patient man. Patient, yes. But now he was moving. She walked back to her wagon with the specific feeling of someone who has run out of time to think and has to start acting instead, with or without a complete plan, which was the worst kind of situation for someone who relied on observation and patience to make decisions. She climbed onto the wagon seat and sat there for a moment before picking up the reins. The town was quiet around her. Mid-morning, sun already hot, the street dusty and thin-trafficked. A few people moving with the careful, conserving energy of people living through a crisis that hadn't fully declared itself yet, but that everyone could feel at the edges of every day. A woman came out of the general store with a basket and glanced at Marin and then looked away, and in that glance was the same calculation Marin had been seeing on people's faces for weeks. The recalibration happening every time they saw her, the update being applied to whatever they'd believed about her before. The noisy birds, the crumbling hillside farm, the woman everyone had laughed at. She picked up the reins. When she got back to the property, Owen was waiting for her at the gate, which he did when something had happened that he thought she needed to know immediately. He had Duchess tucked under one arm in the particular unconscious way he held that bird, Duchess being the one guinea fowl on the property that had decided human contact was acceptable under specific conditions, Owen being one of those conditions. 3 people from town came to the fence while you were gone, he said. The Riordan's son, Thomas, not the father, and 2 women I didn't know. They stood at the fence for a while looking at the flock and then left without saying anything. Did they say anything to you? Thomas Riordan said, so these are the birds. That was it. Marin climbed down from the wagon. Harlan's making a move, she said. He's going to try to take control of the community response before we can. Owen looked at her. Duchess made a considering sound. Then we have to move first, he said. Yes. She tied off the horse and looked at the flock working the slope. 31 birds, 31 plus the 10 at Bellamy. 31 that she'd built from 12 over 8 months of work she couldn't do again fast enough if she lost them. We do. She opened her notebook to the page titled Boundary Problem and read the last line she'd written. The question is whether you can make yourself more useful to this town than he is before he does. She turned to a clean page. She picked up her pencil. She began to write the plan. The plan she wrote that night covered 4 pages in the second notebook, front and back, with numbers in the margins and arrows connecting ideas she hadn't fully worked out yet. It wasn't clean. It had crossed out sections and rewritten paragraphs, and one place where she'd pressed the pencil so hard it tore the paper slightly. She didn't rewrite it neatly. Neat plans were for people who had time. The core of it was simple enough to explain in 2 sentences. She would propose a community rotation system to the town council before Harlan could formalize his own proposal, and she would make the terms specific enough that what she was offering was visibly different from what he was offering. The difference being this: her system gave the community ownership of the solution. His system gave the community dependency on him. The difficulty was getting into the council meeting before Harlan's lawyers did. She went to see Gideon at first light. He was already up, which she'd expected. Old farmers didn't sleep past dawn. It was a constitutional inability. And he had coffee on, which she hadn't expected but accepted with genuine gratitude. They sat at his kitchen table with the morning coming through the window, and she laid out the plan the same way she'd written it. Not selling it, not softening it, just presenting it as the situation and the response. Gideon listened with his hands around his cup and his eyes on the table, which was how he listened when he was taking something seriously. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The council meets again Thursday, he said. Harlan requested the session. He'll have his proposal ready. Then I need to be there Wednesday, before the meeting. The council doesn't take unsolicited presentations. I know. I need someone to request it on my behalf. She looked at him. Someone they can't easily ignore. Gideon looked back at her. He had farmed this valley for 40 years. He had fed half the families at this table during hard years, had known the council members since before some of them could vote, had a reputation for plain dealing that was the closest thing to currency you could hold in a place like Ashridge Crossing. He picked up his cup, drank, set it down. All right, he said, I'll go this morning. The council agreed to hear her Wednesday afternoon, which Marin suspected was less about Gideon's persuasion and more about the fact that Doc Pruitt had told them the previous day that the fever cases had reached 11, and one of them was a council member's nephew. Crisis had a way of expanding people's willingness to listen. She spent Tuesday and Wednesday morning doing 3 things simultaneously: running the property, organizing the data from 8 months of observation into the clearest form she could manage, and trying to prepare Owen for the possibility that this would fail and they'd need to act independently of the council's support. If Harlan wins the council vote, she told Owen on Wednesday morning, he'll try to acquire birds from outside the county and set up his own operation. It'll take him weeks to source them, and weeks more to establish any kind of working flock management. In that time, the outbreak gets worse. So we keep moving regardless, Owen said. He was repairing a section of the eastern fence line, driving stakes with efficient practice swings that were nothing like the tentative carpentry of his first months on the property. The Bellamy birds are working. We push the rotation anyway, whether the council endorses it or not. Without council backing, the families who need help most won't accept it. They'll wait for whatever Harlan is promising. She handed him the next stake. The frontier runs on authority. People wait for the person who looks like they have it before they act. Owen drove the stake and looked up. Then you need to look like you have it. She held his gaze for a moment. I need to look like I know what I'm doing, which I do. Then that's the same thing, he said, and turned back to the fence. The council chamber was the back room of the land office, which meant she walked past Aldrich Pruitt's desk to get there. Pruitt, who had warned her about the land's history on her first day in Ashridge Crossing, and who now watched her pass with an expression that was carefully neutral, and therefore told her nothing. There were 5 council members. She knew 2 of them by face and 1 by name, Councilman Edgar Fitch, who ran the feed store and had a practical farmer's skepticism about anything he hadn't personally verified. The others were a banker, a rancher, and a man she recognized as one of the people who had been standing outside the hardware store the day she drove into town with her screaming birds and her $43. She did not think about that. She set her notebook on the table and stood in front of them and told them what she knew. She didn't perform. She didn't appeal to their sympathies or their civic pride or anything except the specific practical situation they were in. She showed them the drag counts, the systematic 8 months of data that documented tick eradication on her property, alongside the pressure from unmanaged neighboring land. She explained the life cycle disruption. She told them about the Bellamy operation, 10 days old, and the early indications that boundary pressure on her southwest perimeter was declining. She laid out the rotation proposal, 3 groups of birds, cycling through the highest priority properties on a 2-week schedule, asking from each participating family only grain, daily water maintenance, and labor cooperation during transitions. "What's it cost us?" said the banker, whose name she still didn't know. "Grain for the birds during their time on your property. That's the direct cost. The indirect cost is the labor of learning a new animal management routine, which is not trivial, but is manageable." She paused. "The cost of not doing this is what you're already seeing. Victor Harlan has proposed a similar solution," said the rancher. "A man named Cole," she remembered now, "who ran cattle in the western section of the valley. He's sourcing birds from a breeder in—" "I know what he's proposing," Marin said. "The difference is timing and control. A sourced flock from outside the county will take a minimum of 4 weeks to arrive and another 4 to 6 weeks before they're established enough on new terrain to be effective. The outbreak is at 11 cases and a rising curve. That's 8 to 10 weeks of unchecked transmission." She let that sit for a moment. "My birds are already working. They are working right now. The Bellamy property is the proof." Edgar Fitch, the feed store owner, leaned forward. "You said the rotation asked for labor cooperation. What exactly does that mean, from our end?" "Someone from each property needs to learn the daily management routine, batram, feeding, water, checking on flock positioning. It's an hour a day, maybe 2, during the transition week. My boy Owen Carter has been running the Bellamy operation, and he can do the initial training on each new property." "Carter?" said the man she recognized from the hardware store. His name was Briggs, not Stella's husband, a cousin of some kind. "The orphan Caldwell boy." "Owen Carter," Marin said. "He's been managing my flock operation since last fall, and he's more competent at it than most adults I've dealt with. If his age is your concern, I'd suggest watching him work before forming that opinion." Briggs looked like he had something else to say about that. He didn't say it, possibly because Fitch was watching him. "The birds you send to other properties," said Fitch, "they stay under your ownership? They stay under my management. The host family cares for them during the rotation period, and in exchange gets the tick management benefit. At the end of the rotation cycle, the birds return and a new group goes out. As the flock grows," she turned the notebook page to the projection she'd worked out, "the rotation becomes faster, and the coverage increases." "Who controls the rotation schedule?" said the banker. "I set the initial schedule based on tick density data. The council can review and adjust it. If you want oversight, I'd welcome it. More eyes on the data means better decisions." She hadn't planned to offer that. It came out of her mouth before she'd thought it through, and then she realized it was right. Offering oversight wasn't weakness. It was how you made something a community operation instead of a private one, which was exactly what she needed this to be. The room was quiet for a moment. "We'll need to discuss," Fitch said. "Of course. I'll be outside." She sat on the step outside the land office for 40 minutes. It was a warm afternoon, the kind of May afternoon that would have felt like a gift in a different year. A dog slept in the shade across the street. 2 women walked past and glanced at her, and she nodded and they nodded back, which was more than she would have gotten 8 months ago. The door opened. Fitch stepped out. "We're approving a trial period," he said. 6 weeks, 5 properties in addition to your own, council review at the end of the 6th week. We'd like to start with the public land corridor, the scrub east of Main Street." "That's the right starting point," she said. "I've got count data on that corridor from last week. It's the most critical source. There'll be a formal agreement drafted. Pruitt will handle it." "That's fine." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone updating a long-held assessment. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Holloway. There were people in that room who wanted to wait for Harlan's proposal." "I know. What changed their mind was the data, not the birds, not the arguments, the numbers in that notebook." Good, she said. That's what the numbers are for. She drove back to the property and told Owen, who received the news with a short nod and immediately started talking about flock division logistics, which was exactly the right response. The first rotation began 4 days later. They sent 8 birds to the public land corridor, managed from a temporary enclosure Maren and Owen built in 2 days at the edge of the scrub. It was rough work: posts, wire, a small feeding station, a rough shelter against the afternoon sun. And it wasn't elegant, but it held, which was the only thing that mattered. Owen ran the corridor operation every morning before coming to the main property, a route that added 2 miles to his daily travel, which he made without comment. The second rotation group, 7 birds, went to the Wentworth spread, where the original fatal case had occurred and where the grief was still raw enough that Walt Wentworth, the rancher, barely spoke to either of them when they brought the flock out. He showed them where to establish the enclosure and walked away. Maren led him. There was nothing to say to a man in that particular pain that wasn't an intrusion. The third group stayed on the Bellamy property, the 10 birds that had been working there for almost 3 weeks now, whose impact on the southwest boundary Maren was measuring every other day with a hopefulness she was careful not to let become assumption. Her main flock was down to 16 birds. She walked the property every evening and told herself the coverage was holding and mostly believed it. It was during this period, the stretched, tense 2 weeks when the rotation was running on 3 fronts, and the town was watching, and Harlan had gone quiet in a way that felt more deliberate than absent, that the small things started to go wrong. The first was the water supply for the corridor enclosure. Someone, she never established who, opened the spigot on the supply line she'd rigged from the nearest water source and left it running overnight, draining the tank. She arrived in the morning to find the enclosure water gone, and 3 birds huddled under the shelter looking miserable. Nobody had done it maliciously that she could prove. It might have been a child. It might have been an accident. She refilled the tank and built a cover for the spigot and didn't mention it to anyone except Owen. "It wasn't an accident," Owen said. "Maybe not. It doesn't matter. We fix it and continue." The second thing was a council member, Briggs, the one from the hardware store, who arrived at the corridor enclosure one afternoon while Owen was doing the daily feed and management check, and stood watching for 20 minutes without speaking, then asked Owen a series of questions about the management protocol that had the texture of someone building a record rather than someone curious. Owen answered everything plainly and completely, which was both his strength and, in this context, something Maren wished she could have coached him on. Not to lie, never to lie, but to understand that some questions are not requests for information. "He wrote things down," Owen reported that evening. "I know, he's on the council. He has a right to review the operation. He asked specifically how many birds are in each rotation group and whether any birds have died since the operation started." Maren was quiet. "Have any died?" "One of the Wentworth group, 4 days ago. Old bird, I think. She'd been moving slow for weeks." He looked at her. "Natural causes. I'll document it. Date, bird, observed condition beforehand." She picked up the notebook. "Every death gets documented from now on. If someone is building a case that the operation is failing, we need the record to show exactly what's happening and why." "You think Harlan is feeding information to Briggs?" "I think it's possible." She wrote the entry. "Or Briggs has his own reasons. Either way, the answer is the same: documentation." It was 10 days into the rotation that the fever cases peaked, and then slowly began to fall. It happened without announcement, without a clear turning point anyone could identify. Doc Pruitt noted it first. Not 0 new cases, but the rate of new transmissions slowing. The existing cases were resolving, mostly. The blacksmith's wife improved enough to sit up and eat. The Bellamy child was out of bed, pale and thinner but upright, which her father reported to Maren at the fence line one morning with a brevity that she understood to be the maximum expression of gratitude he was capable of. "Birds are working," he said. "They are," Maren said. He nodded and walked back to his cattle. But the case that mattered most to what came next happened not on a farm, but in the feed store, on a Tuesday afternoon when Maren was picking up supplies. She heard Victor Harlan's voice before she saw him. He was at the counter, talking to Edgar Fitch, and she came around the end of a shelf of tool stock, and they both looked at her, and the conversation stopped with the specific stop of people who had been talking about something they didn't want overhead. Harlan recovered first. He always recovered first. "Miss Holloway, I hear the rotation operation is showing some results. Early results, she said. The data from the corridor is promising. Good, good. He had his hat in his hands, which she'd learned to read as a performance of approachability. I've been meaning to ask. One of your corridor birds went missing last week, the reddish-marked one. Any sign of it? She looked at him. He looked back, easy and comfortable, waiting for her answer, and she understood in that moment, the precise, specific moment, that he had just made a mistake. Not a small one. The bird he was describing, the one with the reddish marking on its chest, was a bird she'd privately documented in her notebook as distinguishable by a specific set of markings. She had never described those markings to anyone outside of her own records, except in one place, the notebook she kept on the property, not in any report to the council, not in conversation with Gideon or Pruitt or Stella, not with Owen, because Owen knew every bird by sight and didn't need descriptions written down. The only way Victor Harlan could describe a missing bird with that level of specificity was if he'd had access to her records, or if he'd been close enough to the corridor enclosure to observe the individual birds himself, or if someone working for him had taken the bird. And if he'd told that person which bird to take, he would have had to describe it, which meant he'd been watching the operation closely enough to identify individual birds, which meant the water incident probably wasn't a child. She kept her face still. I hadn't noticed a missing bird, she said. Which one are you describing? Harlan's expression shifted by something less than a quarter inch. The one with, I believe someone mentioned it to me, reddish chest marking, smaller than the others. Who mentioned it to you? A pause, very short. I don't recall exactly. Town talk. Interesting, Marin said. I'll keep an eye out. She bought her supplies and left. She rode the wagon back to the property faster than she needed to and went straight to the notebook. She found the entry she was looking for, a description she'd written in February, one of the new birds, noting the unusual reddish-brown patch on the bird's lower chest as a distinguishing mark for tracking purposes. She'd never read that entry aloud to anyone. She was nearly certain she'd never described that bird verbally to anyone. She sat for a long time. Then she went to find Owen, who was at the east fence doing afternoon checks. Harlan knows about the reddish-marked bird, she said, the February female. He described her as missing from the corridor. Owen turned around. She's not missing. She's in the main flock. I moved her back 3 days ago because she was showing stress behavior in the corridor environment, too much foot traffic near the enclosure. She needs quieter terrain. He frowned. How does Harlan know about her markings? That's the question, Marin said, and the fact that he raised it is either careless or arrogant. Or both, Owen said. Or both. She looked across the property. I need you to do something. I need you to go back to the corridor enclosure this evening and count every bird by individual markings. Don't move anything. Don't change anything. Just count and tell me what you see. You think one was actually taken. To establish that the operation has losses. I think it's possible. A missing bird is documentation of failure, especially if Briggs is recording losses. She met his eyes. Count carefully. Owen went that evening. He came back after dark. All the corridor birds are present, he said. All 8. But there are boot prints on the north side of the enclosure that don't match either of us. Wide toe, medium heel, different tread from anything we wear. She nodded slowly. The next morning, she went to Edgar Fitch. She told him what had happened at the feed store. The description, the specificity, the impossibility of Harlan knowing it through ordinary town talk. She told him about the water incident. She told him about Briggs's questions to Owen. She laid it out the same way she laid out everything: data, sequence, conclusion, evidence. Fitch listened with his hands flat on his desk. You're accusing Victor Harlan of interfering with a council-sanctioned operation, he said. I'm presenting evidence of unusual knowledge and unusual incidents and asking the council to draw its own conclusions. She set the notebook on his desk, open to the February entry. This is the description of that bird. Written in February? I challenge anyone to tell me how Victor Harlan knew those markings through casual conversation. Fitch looked at the entry for a long time. I'm going to need to discuss this, he said. I know, but discuss it before Thursday's review session, because if he presents a case to the council that the operation has losses and failures and should be suspended in favor of his external sourcing proposal, And if the council doesn't know about this first, she stopped. People are recovering. The rate is dropping. If this operation gets suspended now, those gains reverse and we start over. Fitch closed the notebook and pushed it back toward her. Come to the Thursday session, he said. I'll make sure there's time on the agenda. The Thursday session had more people in it than any council meeting in recent memory, which Marin learned when she arrived and found the back room of the land office, with men standing along the walls, and Gideon near the front with a seat he'd gotten there early to secure. Stella Briggs was there, which surprised her until she thought about it and then didn't. Doc Pruitt was there. Walt Bellamy was there, which surprised her considerably. Victor Harlan arrived with two men she didn't recognize and took a seat at the front, easy and unhurried. The session opened with Pruitt's update on the fever cases. The numbers were moving in the right direction. New cases down, recovery rate improving, no new deaths since the rotation began. He said this in the precise, flat language of a medical man, without editorializing, which meant the numbers did their own work. Then Harlan stood up. He presented his proposal. The external sourcing, the centralized management, the argument that a private operation run by an individual farmer was an insufficient foundation for a community-wide public health response. He said it well. He had a lawyer's precision and a powerful man's confidence, and the argument had a real logic to it that Marin couldn't dismiss. Scale and resources mattered. He had more of both than she did. Then Fitch asked him a question. Mr. Harlan, you mentioned at Dorsey's feed store last Tuesday that one of Miss Holloway's corridor birds had gone missing, a reddish-marked female. Can you tell us who informed you of that? The room was quiet. Harlan's face didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. I believe it came up in conversation. I don't recall the specific source. The bird in question, Fitch continued, is documented in Miss Holloway's management records as distinguishable by a specific chest marking. Those records are private and have not been shared in any public forum. Doc Pruitt, Gideon Mercer, and Owen Carter have all confirmed they don't recall describing that bird in any conversation. He paused. The bird, incidentally, is not missing. It's been accounted for, so the information was both specific and incorrect. The room had the particular quality of a room that is very still. Harlan said something about misremembering, about the volume of information he managed, about how it was easy to confuse details when you were running an operation the size of his. It was, Marin thought, technically possible. A man who manages large operations does deal with a lot of information. It was possible. It was also, as Walt Bellamy said from his standing position along the left wall, speaking for the first time since he'd arrived, in the measured tone of a man who doesn't speak unless he's certain, a strange thing to misremember. The markings of a bird on somebody else's property. The room moved, not dramatically, not with shouting or confrontation. The council members looked at each other, and the people along the walls looked at the council members, and something shifted in the distribution of the room's weight that Victor Harlan, for all his patience and all his lawyers, could feel happening. He didn't collapse. He wasn't finished in Ashridge Crossing. A man with his resources and his land holdings didn't collapse from a council room moment. But his proposal to take over the community operation died in that room on that Thursday, without a vote ever being called, simply because the council had looked at each other and understood something they couldn't ununderstand. The rotation continued. The community meeting that followed the council session was informal, people drifting out of the land office and staying to talk on the street, the way frontier communities process things, in the open air rather than formal chambers. Marin stood with Gideon and answered questions from people she barely knew, explaining the rotation schedule, explaining what host families would be responsible for, explaining why grain sharing was the practical basis of the arrangement. Walt Bellamy shook her hand before he left. He did it quickly, with his chin down, the way men shake hands when they're embarrassed about needing to. She shook it. That evening she sat on the step of the farmhouse, not the ruined corner, the actual step of the south-facing wall she'd been slowly repairing, which now had a roof over it that only leaked in one place, and she let herself feel the exhaustion of the past 3 weeks, which she'd been postponing until she had space for it. Owen sat beside her, which he did sometimes when neither of them had anything in particular to say. The flock settled in the scrub for the night, their last noise fading into the ordinary sounds of the hillside. "Are we okay?" Owen said, eventually. Marin thought about everything the word okay was trying to cover. "We're still here," she said, The birds are working. The council backed us. She leaned her head back against the wall. That's okay for now. Harlan's not done, Owen said. No, he's not. But he's weaker than he was. Yes, he is. Owen pulled at a loose thread on his boot, which was a habit he'd never managed to break. The Wentworths asked me this afternoon if we could extend the rotation there for an extra 2 weeks. They said the difference in the pasture is they could see it in the cattle behavior. The animals go back to the areas they were avoiding. Marin closed her eyes briefly. I'll add 2 weeks. I told them you'd probably say yes, Owen said. She let that sit there. The night came in from the east, soft and full of the sounds that meant the valley was still alive and working, still managing its complicated balance of insects and soil and water, and the people trying to make something out of all of it. It was holding. For now, it was holding. The 6-week council review came on a Thursday in late June, and Marin arrived with 3 notebooks instead of 1. The second and third were new. She'd filled the original in May and started fresh, and the volume of data from 6 weeks of running 5 simultaneous rotation sites had generated more documentation than she'd produced in the entire previous 8 months combined. Numbers, dates, drag counts before and after, bird behavior logs, host family reports she'd collected in writing from each participating property. She set them on the table in the back room of the land office and watched the council members look at the stack with the expression people get when they're confronted with more evidence than they were prepared to evaluate. The short version, she said, is that tick counts on participating properties are down an average of 73% from baseline. Doc Pruitt can speak to the fever case numbers. The rotation is working. Pruitt spoke to the fever case numbers. They were good numbers. 3 new cases in the past 4 weeks, all mild, all recovered. 0 deaths since the operation expanded. He said this in the same flat medical precision he used for bad news, which meant it landed harder than if he'd tried to make it sound like a victory. The council voted to extend the trial period to permanent status. It wasn't unanimous. Briggs voted against it for reasons he stated as budgetary and that Marin suspected were something else entirely. But 4-1 was enough, and Fitch signed the agreement that afternoon while Pruitt witnessed it, and Marin stood in the room feeling less triumphant than she'd expected and more tired than she'd anticipated. Gideon was waiting outside when she came out. Done? He said. Done, she said. He nodded once, the way he acknowledged things that mattered without making a production of it. Come have coffee. She did. They sat at his kitchen table again, in the same chairs as the December morning when he told her the Riordan family was leaving, and the light through the window was the long, warm light of early summer instead of the thin, cold light of winter. And that difference felt like a measurement of something. What happens to Harlan now? She said. Gideon wrapped his hands around his cup. He still owns the land he bought, the Caswell parcel, the Henderson property, the Riordan spread. The railroad corridor may still come through. That hasn't changed. He paused. What's changed is his standing. The council knows what happened in that room. The families know. In a small community, that kind of knowledge doesn't disappear. He'll wait, Marin said. He's patient. He said so himself. Yes, but waiting costs something too. He had a window to consolidate control of this valley, and it's narrowed considerably. Gideon looked at her. You understand what you did, don't you? It wasn't just the tick management. It was that you made the community's survival something the community owned. He couldn't buy that out from under them once they'd already done it themselves. She thought about the day she'd offered the council oversight of the rotation schedule, the thing she hadn't planned to say that turned out to be the right thing to say. I wasn't trying to be strategic about it, she said. I know. That's why it worked. She drove back to the property in the late afternoon and found Owen at the farmhouse, sitting on the south step with a piece of paper in his hands, reading it with the careful expression he wore for things that mattered. He looked up when she came through the gate. The Caldwells sent a letter, he said. Marin tied the horse and sat beside him on the step. What does it say? They want me to come back. He folded the letter along its existing creases slowly. Mr. Caldwell got work with a timber operation north of here. They have a place with more room. They say they've got space and they want me back. She looked at the folded letter in his hands. What do you want? He was quiet for a moment. Not the short quiet of someone thinking. The longer quiet of someone who already knows the answer and is figuring out how to say it without it sounding wrong. I want to stay here, he said. But I don't know if that's I don't know if it's the right thing to want. Why wouldn't it be? Because the Caldwells took me in when nobody else would. Because it might look ungrateful. He set the letter on his knee. And because I don't know what I actually am here. I work for you. That's different from... He stopped. She understood what he was not finishing. It was different from belonging somewhere, from having a claim on a place that was more than employment. She picked up the letter and read it. The Caldwells seemed like decent people. The letter was genuinely warm, not obligatory. They missed him. They had room. She folded it back the way he'd had it and handed it to him. I can't tell you what to decide, she said, but I can tell you what's true, which is that this farm doesn't function the way it functions without you in it. Not because I couldn't find someone else to do the work, but because you're the one who named the birds and watched the nest behavior and figured out the rotation math before I did. You're not hired help, Owen. You're the other half of what this place is. He looked at the letter. I'm 13, he said. I know. That's young to be the other half of something. Yes, she said. It is. He sat with that for a while. The flock moved in the scrub above the house, audible but not visible. Their continuous argument with the insect world carrying on without concern for any of the human complications below. I'll write to the Caldwells, he said finally. I'll explain it. I'll sign the letter if that helps. Whatever I can do to make it right with them. He nodded, still looking at the letter. Then he folded it again and put it in his coat pocket and stood up. The Wentworth extension is at day 9. I need to do the evening count. Go, she said. She watched him walk back through the gate and down the road, thin and purposeful in the long evening light, his coat too big in the shoulders the way it had always been, his boots still occasionally coming unlaced, not fixed, not transformed into anything other than what he was. Just continuing. That was the thing about endurance that nobody told you when you were young. It didn't feel like strength while you were doing it. It felt like the absence of any better option. You kept going, not because you were brave, but because stopping had consequences and you'd seen enough of those consequences to prefer moving. She went inside and started on the books for the month. The summer settled in and the rotation continued, and the valley began, slowly and without ceremony, to repair itself. The tick population didn't vanish. She wasn't naive about that, and she told anyone who asked the same thing. This was management, not elimination. The birds were maintaining a pressure that kept the parasite load below the threshold where it caused the kind of cascading damage the spring outbreak had produced. Remove the birds, let the management lapse for a season, and the population would rebound. This was not a problem that had been solved. It was a problem that had been brought under control, and the difference between those two things was the difference between being able to relax and being able to breathe. She told this to Fitch when he came to do the council's quarterly review in August, walking the property with her the way Gideon had walked it in the beginning, asking questions that were better than she'd expected from him. So this is permanent, he said. Not a question exactly. More like someone finalizing a calculation. As long as the flock is maintained and the rotation continues, yes. The host families understand it now. Walt Bellamy has started thinking about acquiring his own birds for permanent installation on his eastern pasture. Would that change your rotation plan? It would mean I could shift his rotation slot to a property that needs it more. There are 3 farms along the northern ridge that haven't been in the program yet because we didn't have enough birds. Bellamy getting his own flock frees up a slot. She walked him to the east fence line, where the drag count marker was. The goal is to get to a point where every property in this valley has either its own resident birds or reliable rotation access. At that point, the valley manages itself. My role becomes training and flock health, not active daily management. Fitch looked at the marker. That's a significant undertaking. It is, but it's achievable. The flock is at 63 birds now. He looked at her. 63. You started with 12. 12, she confirmed, and the ones from February's second crate. The rest is natural increase. He shook his head slightly, not with skepticism, with the particular movement of a man revising his estimate of something. When the railroad survey finalizes, there are going to be land value questions across the valley. Properties that were marginal are going to become interesting to outside capital. I know. Harlan is going to be one of the people those conversations happen through, whether anyone likes it or not. He has the land and the relationships. I know that too. She looked out over the property, the rebuilt garden beds, The seeded hillside that had taken hold through the spring and was now supporting good ground cover, the repaired farmhouse with its south wall solid and its roof sealed to all but the worst rain. What I have is something he can't buy. I have the knowledge of how this land actually works, documented over 18 months. And I have relationships with every family in this valley that were built on them watching their cattle come back to their pastures and their children's fevers break. Fitch was quiet for a moment. You might consider filing a formal expansion of your land holding, he said. The parcel to the northeast of yours. It came back on the market last month. Kelfer family, they've decided to go west. The price is low because of the record. She looked at him. You're suggesting I buy it. I'm suggesting you consider it. The railroad corridor. He stopped. Your 10 acres sit between Harlan's northeastern grazing route and whatever the rail line decides to do. Another 12 acres on the northeast side of yours would complicate his corridor option significantly and increase your own land's value substantially. She thought about what she had in the cash box in the farmhouse. Not much. Better than she'd had in the winter, because the council program paid a small monthly stipend for her management role that she'd been careful with, and because the vegetable operation was producing enough for a genuine market surplus that Stella was moving through the mercantile without either of them making a formal arrangement of it. Not enough for a land purchase, but possibly enough for a deposit if a sympathetic party would extend credit. Is there a bank in this valley that would consider a loan to a woman running a bird operation on a hillside? She said. Fitch almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen him get to one. The banker on the council voted for your program extension 4-1. That's a different posture than 6 months ago. She filed the inquiry the following week. The loan took 3 weeks to approve, during which she slept badly and worked hard and told herself that the worst outcome was a rejection, which would leave her exactly where she already was. It was approved. The terms were conservative. Short repayment window, reasonable interest, an asset requirement that made her list the flock as collateral, which she did with the specific discomfort of someone pledging the thing they're most afraid of losing. But it was approved. She bought the Kelfer parcel on a Wednesday in late August and walked it twice the same afternoon, the way she'd walked her original 10 acres on her first day in Ashridge Crossing, looking at it not as what it was, but as what it could become. It was rough, rockier than her own land in the upper section, better soil than she expected along the eastern creek branch, big stands of scrub that would take 2 full rotation cycles to bring under management, a collapsed outbuilding that had better bones than her original ruined farmhouse. She stood in the middle of it in the late afternoon heat and felt the specific feeling of a problem that was larger than your current resources and would require time you weren't sure you had, and recognized it as the same feeling she'd had standing on her original 10 acres 16 months ago. She went back to her farmhouse and told Owen. He looked at the deed. He looked at the rough map she'd drawn of the parcel. He turned it sideways, which was a habit he had with maps. The Eastern Creek branch, he said. That feeds into our creek. Yes. So the water table connection means whatever we're doing on our land has already been affecting the soil composition on that parcel from the eastern boundary. She hadn't thought about it from that angle. Probably, yes. Which means the ground isn't starting from zero. It's been getting secondary benefit for a year and a half. He turned the map right side up. It's better than it looks. How do you always do that? She said. Do what? Find the thing I haven't seen yet. He considered this seriously, because he considered most things seriously. I think it's because I came to the birds before I came to the problems. You arrived here with the problems already in front of you. The land, the money, Harlan, all of it. I arrived and the first thing I did was watch Duchess work the scrub for an afternoon. So I always see the birds first and the problems second. She sat with that for a long time after he left for the evening. It was true. And it was something she'd been circling around for months without finding the words for. The reason the system worked, the reason her 10 acres had survived and then thrived when every comparable piece of land in the valley had struggled, wasn't the birds themselves. Plenty of people knew guinea fowl ate ticks. Gideon's father had known it in Tennessee 50 years ago. The knowledge wasn't rare. What was rare was the willingness to follow the bird's logic instead of imposing her own. To look at the land's behavior and let it tell her what it needed, rather than arriving with a plan and demanding the land accommodate it. She'd done that partly because she had no resources for the conventional approach, and partly because she was stubborn enough to believe that careful observation was worth more than capital, which was a proposition she'd had to prove and had proved, slowly, over 16 months of counting ticks on a piece of cloth. Victor Harlan hadn't been wrong about resources mattering. Resources mattered enormously. But resources without understanding were what the 11 years of failed attempts on her hillside looked like. Well-capitalized people importing their methods and watching them fail against a landscape that had its own logic that nobody had taken the time to learn. She had taken the time. That was the whole of it, when she reduced it down. She took the time. The fall harvest came in that year at levels none of the valley farms had seen in the drought years, which everyone attributed to the rain pattern improving, which was also true, but incomplete. The farms with the longest rotation history had soil health numbers. Marin measured them carefully and shared the data with anyone who wanted it. That exceeded what the rainfall improvement alone would explain. The birds had been doing something to the soil, the way she'd started to suspect in her first winter and had been documenting ever since. The nitrogen cycling from their droppings, the surface tillage from their constant movement, the insect population management that allowed beneficial soil organisms to recover, it was adding up to something measurable. She wrote it up in a formal document for the first time in October, not for the council, but for the county agricultural extension officer, who came out to the property on a Tuesday and walked the land with her for 3 hours and asked questions she hadn't been asked before, the kind that told her he was taking it seriously as a system rather than a curiosity. He asked if she'd consider presenting at the Territorial Agricultural Conference in February. She said she'd think about it. She thought about it for 2 days and then said yes, because the question of whether this could work beyond Ashridge Crossing was one she'd been quietly holding for months. And the only way to find out was to say it in a room where people who ran other kinds of land could tell her whether she was wrong. She told Owen. He was quiet for a moment with the expression of someone updating a longer calculation. That means the Valley program needs to run independently of you for a week. At least, it can do that. The host families know the routine now. I can cover the monitoring. He looked at her. You should write a management guide, not just the data, a plain language guide that someone who's never seen a guinea fowl could use to run a rotation without you. That's a significant document. Yes, he said. You should start now. She started that evening. It took her the better part of 3 weeks writing in the evenings after the property work was done. In the repaired farmhouse with the south wall solid around her and the iron stove holding the autumn cold at bay and the sound of the flock settling into their night routine outside. It was 53 pages when she finished, which was longer than she'd intended, but she couldn't find anything in it that didn't need to be there. Owen read all of it and corrected 2 factual errors about bird behavior she'd gotten wrong, and added a section on keat management during the integration phase that was better than anything she'd written on the subject. She put his name on it alongside hers. He objected to this. I'm 13, he said. Nobody's going to take a document seriously if a 13-year-old wrote part of it. You did write part of it, and you'll be 14 in February. She set the document on the table between them. I didn't put your name on it to be kind. I put it on because the guide is more accurate with your contributions than without them, and if I take credit for something you did, the guide is partially wrong about its own origins. He looked at his name on the front page for a long time. All right, he said finally. October became November, became the long quiet of the second winter, which was different from the first in every way that mattered. She had a farmhouse instead of a lean-to. She had a flock of 67 birds instead of 12. She had a second parcel under management, its scrub beginning to show the first signs of response to the rotation she'd started there in September. She had Owen, who had written to the Caldwells and explained himself with a directness that she thought probably came from practicing explanation on birds who didn't care about social grace, and who was spending the winter evenings in the farmhouse doing the reading she'd been setting aside for him. History, natural science, the agricultural texts she'd borrowed and never quite returned from the county library. And she had Gideon, who came by less often now. His health was declining in the gradual way that old people's health declines, with good weeks and bad weeks, and an overall direction that both of them understood without discussing it. He came in November and walked the newer parcel with her, slowly, with the same attention he'd always brought. This land's going to work, he said, standing in the eastern section with the afternoon sun low and long across the scrub. I know, she said. Takes patience. I've noticed that about most things worth doing. He smiled at that, a real one, not the almost smile she was used to. You know what people are saying about you in town now? I try not to know. They're saying you were right from the start, that you knew what you were doing. He looked at her. They've forgotten that they laughed. She looked out over the scrub. A group of birds from the northeast rotation was working the far edge of the property, moving through the dry grass in the systematic way she'd been watching for 18 months, the way she'd never once seen them do anything other than just work. Just keep working. It doesn't matter what they remember, she said. No, Gideon agreed. It doesn't. He went home before dark, and she stood at the fence line for a while after he left, thinking about what had happened to the person she'd been when she drove into Ashridge Crossing with $43 and a crate of ugly birds. Not who she'd become. That was the wrong framing, the kind that implied she'd been lacking something and had acquired it. More like what she'd learned to trust. She'd always been the person who paid attention. She'd always been the person who followed a problem's logic wherever it led without caring too much whether the destination was the one she'd planned. She'd just never had land that was hers before. Never had a place where the consequences of attention were hers to keep. That was what the 10 acres had given her. Not success, not vindication. The space to let what she already knew be useful. You couldn't make someone understand that from the outside. The woman everyone had laughed at, that story was easy to tell because it had a clear shape. People were wrong, the woman was right. The proof arrived in the end. But that wasn't actually what had happened. What had happened was more ordinary and more strange. A woman had bought ugly birds because they were the only thing she could afford that had the right instincts for the land she had. She'd paid attention, she'd taken notes, she'd stayed when it would have been easier to leave. Not because she was certain it would work, but because certainty was a luxury she'd never had enough of to require. And the land had responded. Not to her ambition, to her attention. That was the thing she would try to say in February, in front of the people at the territorial conference who had better land and more capital and longer track records than she did. Not, I was right and everyone else was wrong. Something more uncomfortable and more useful. The land knows things. The insects and the birds and the soil and the water table have a logic that runs deeper than any plan you arrive with. Your job is not to impose. Your job is to watch long enough to learn the logic and then work within it. Most people didn't have the patience for that. Most people arrived with their methods and demanded the land comply. She didn't blame them. Patience was expensive when you were afraid, and most people working frontier land were afraid most of the time. Afraid of the drought, afraid of the debt, afraid of the Victor Harlans who were always circling. She'd been afraid too. She just hadn't let the fear set the schedule. The conference went the way things went when you told a complicated truth to people who had been expecting a simple one. Some people got it immediately, some people argued with it, some people left before she finished, and one of those people came back the next day and asked better questions than anyone else in the room. She didn't convert anyone to anything. She presented the data, explained the system, answered the questions honestly, including the ones whose answers were "I don't know yet" and were still studying it. 2 agricultural officers asked if they could come to Ashridge Crossing in the spring. She said yes. She drove back from the conference through the February cold with the particular exhaustion of having said difficult true things in front of strangers, which was different from any other kind of exhaustion. Owen met her at the gate with the flock count and the drag data from the week she'd been gone, organized on a fresh page in his own handwriting, which had improved considerably from the cramped, uncertain letters of his first months on the property. Everything held? She said. Everything held. The Wentworth birds need a rotation shift. I'd moved them to the Northern Ridge section earlier than scheduled. The density readings suggest... Show me tomorrow, she said. I need to sleep first. He looked at her. How was it? Complicated. She handed him the wagon reins. But worth going. He took the reins and started walking the horse toward the small stable she'd built against the northwest wall of the farmhouse last autumn. Did they listen? Some of them, she said. Enough of them. He nodded, the same way he nodded when she told him something was going to take longer than he wanted but was moving in the right direction. That's something, he said. She went inside where the fire had been kept and the farmhouse was warm and the shelves held the preserved autumn harvest in their rows of glass jars. And she sat down at the table where the notebooks were stacked, 4 of them now. And she thought about the first morning she'd sat in this broken place with nothing but bad land and 12 loud birds, and a very thin plan that even she hadn't fully believed in. She'd written in the first notebook on that day, "They know something about this land I don't know yet. Follow their logic." She still believed that, more than she had then. She still didn't know everything they knew, but she'd learned enough to build something real on a piece of ground that everyone else had given up on. With a boy who named birds, and an old man who walked the land, and a doctor who spoke plain, and a feed store owner who paid attention, and 100 small cooperative acts that added up over time to a valley that had survived something it hadn't been expected to survive. Not because someone powerful saved it, because enough ordinary people paid enough ordinary attention for long enough that the land had a fighting chance. She opened the 5th notebook to the first page. She picked up her pencil. She wrote the date at the top, and then sat for a moment looking at the blank page below it, the way you look at a field before you plant it, aware of everything you don't know yet, and choosing to begin anyway.